think you might want to get me out of here. Industry Corp is here for a reason, remember?
There's no way I can come down there right now. Seems like there's more ships on the way.
Hey and welcome to Zenith Part 4's walkthrough. Right now we're on the map Azure Crag, the 5th mission, and this map was pretty interesting because there were significant renovations applied from the beta version, and it was a sort of total change in terms of the scope of the map because it was sort of a miniature version of Gala's Peak in the beta, but just as boring. This map as a whole is aesthetically sloppy in the sense that it sort of puts these very fascinating and aesthetically pleasing structures and cramps them into an overly simplistic and small space. The map should really have been completely redesigned into something of a combination between Gala's Peak and what the map had become. It indeed needed a lot more open space and a lot more of a grandiose atmosphere. A lot of the reason it was merely renovated was due to limited time. In the same way, it was unfortunate that a great display of skill and lighting went into the creation of the Scar Tower, but once you get into some of the rest of the map, that glamour seems to fade into the older parts of the map that were unruly overall in terms of lighting. The lighting does make sense and try to approach the geometry in a realistic approach, however. It emits lights at angles which real light sources would be coming from, such as the moon in the sky casting an angled light onto the terrain. The atmosphere is sort of a classic Unreal feeling, although the cramped areas sort of take away from this, unfortunately. Now, the interiors aren't particularly interesting, and most of them seem to be sort of passageways to the exterior blocks of the map. What provides some recompense for the map is the introduction of events and unique gameplay, such as interacting with the friendly crawl, and the beginning wherein you have to either watch or intervene into the fight between the Industry Corp soldiers and the Scar at the beginning. That was sort of a distinction between anything that could have happened in a classic Unreal map wherein no such event would occur between two fighting pawn factions. Those are things that the veteran Unreal player would appreciate because they're unique in terms of the light of other Unreal campaigns. Even some of the more prevalent, more well-known, and more critically lauded campaigns. Those campaigns didn't ever really use unique events, except for some of the more technically complicated campaigns, such as 7 Bullets. Now, in terms of flux, unfortunately again the map has poor flux and degrades the potential and performance of the interactions between you and your ally and the combat. The map has poor flux because it's so cramped. The subplot itself doesn't necessarily lead anywhere, but it would be more dull without it. So things like that, little things like that, sort of add on to the map, and at least there's some interesting factors in the old beta region of the map that at least distinguish the map from perhaps a classic single-player campaign in Unreal that didn't have any of that. And mind you, the subplot does sort of link to the previous 2 missions, so I suppose it's not necessarily completely pointless. There is some benefit to learning about that in terms of what's going on with the plot overall. Overall, the map is strange because the castle outpost exterior and the rest of the visuals sort of go along with the same line of visuals that are particularly pleasing in some regions, and then you get to other regions and it sort of feels like a different map or different design style, which indeed it is, because it was sort of a matching, or merging rather, between an old style of architecture, an old design, very old design, and some of the newer parts which were obviously much more aesthetically pleasing and much more well designed. It was largely the Scar Tower that was the only case. And then some of the beta portions, and I'm talking about the part where it was Gala's Peak, basically, the miniature Gala's Peak. It was very old, back from basically the alpha of Zenith. Then you get to the castle outpost area, and that was sort of an intermediary stage between the old style and the final style that you see in the image of the Scar Tower. And interestingly enough, this sort of prevents the map from being as memorable as it could have been, except for that particular part with the Scar Tower, and maybe for the cases where, you know, you have the event with the Crawl ally. But even in that case, it doesn't seem to be a map that you recall after having played the entire campaign. It's clear that there's a firm attempt to provide a look and feel to the map using the atmosphere, music, and so forth, but there's a lot of potential for improvement that never ended up happening.
So it looks like we have a few factions in competition with each other. I'm starting to get that paranoid feeling that someone could shoot me in the back of the head any time now. But it was strange seeing those crawl. I thought they were all slaves of the Scar.
Now we're on the next map, Vector Rocket Lab, the beginning of which again is reminiscent of the old exterior design of the previous maps, sort of the alpha or beta stage that was never really cleaned up due to, again, limited time. And the presentation is thus very lacking, at least at first. However, things get much more interesting as the player continues. The presentation of the lab itself is a much better one in terms of the interior, the fight with the Scar alongside your ally, and the introduction of the Toxmerc, all in one make up for a fairly interesting presentation that sort of, well, at least one that would have had interesting presentation, but was superimposed with this new presentation of the Vector Rocket Lab. That, along with the uniqueness of the look and feel of the interior, which is unlike any of the previous maps really. There's actually two different ways you can complete the map. Both will be shown. Some of it will be shown in picture-in-picture because I want to keep the video as short as possible. So the first is that you go through the power station, which is taking the elevator to the second level. And that is the much faster route, but somewhat more combat intensive. The other way to go is through the core by just accessing the main door at the bottom floor and sort of do an Unreal style button pushing scheme to get past the map. But the fact that the player has a choice as opposed to a single player campaign wherein typically there is no choice. Everything is linear and the map never delves into any possible areas where it could have created something unique, even if it was a little event. In this case, there is a choice. So in one case, you have to go up to the second level, defeat the Toxmercs. You have to keep activating the button to create the shield bridge, and then you go ahead and activate the accelerator. After that, it's pretty easy, going back and pressing the button on the edge of the control room, or outside the control room of the energy area. Then you just go down the tunnel or the pipe and basically just maneuver your way through the rest of the map. The other part is a little bit more complicated because it is sort of a button pushing scheme, wherein you have to go through two different parts of the map, activate two different buttons, then go out to the central core, that big giant area with the rotating elevators or movers. You go to the other side, do a 180-degree rotation to the other side, where you have to activate another button at the end of that hallway, as it were. And after that, you go back to the center. Once you're in the center, you can access the accelerator from there and basically go on through the map as you would had you gone through the energy section. The fact that the player has a choice is sort of advantageous because it sort of distinguishes itself from the single pipe, one beginning, one end sort of thing, like I said before. And it's really the case that overwhelmingly these maps were that single pipeline where you couldn't really do anything else but go through the way the mapper wanted you to go through. It is the same case mostly in these sorts of Zenith maps, except that you're allowed a choice, which again was very rare. The atmosphere and partially the architecture is interesting in the sense that instead of sort of lighting the map up as is typical of really any map in general, you have a very dark, very high contrast map wherein the colors and the, or rather the lighting and the coloration of the map play a much bigger role in the visuals than do the textures and the geometry, or at least the texture. Perhaps the geometry has some sway in sort of shaping how the map looks in terms of the overall visual design. And the architecture is rather simplistic itself, but the great distinctions between the darkness and light, and the almost exclusive use of saturated colored lighting, and simply not just lighting here and there that was sparse, gave the level a unique feel to it. And the combat in this level, as opposed to the previous, is almost always intense. The level is filled with mercenaries, and at some point Scar, and at every other point toxic mercenaries. So you have a sort of mixation between these three types of pawns that provide some uniqueness or some exclusivity to combat, so as to not bore the player with merely one kind of monster. And the combat is always, or usually consistently intense in this map. The level usually doesn't give the player a break, which in some cases is sort of a problem, but overall, actually I think gives the player a better chance to perform well, because the player is always on his toes. The flux is much more improved compared to the previous level in this case. Although in some cases it's not quite clear where you have to go, and some parts of the map probably needed more lighting, it's still a fairly flowing map. Particularly the upper level. The bottom level is a little bit more mysterious, but it's not so vast that it's difficult to explore every area until you find something. It's very clear where the buttons are. So overall, the map was combat intense, was unique, perhaps not the most memorable map, but still did its job to be nominally memorable. The event where you have to overload the accelerator made for an interesting, very unique scene that you don't really see anywhere in Unreal single-player levels. And overall, the level could have probably been more eventful, but the combat was intense, the visuals did their job. So it was a level that certainly met expectations, perhaps not exceeded them in a very magnanimous way, but certainly met expectations. Now the next map is much more of a passage map, Sophos Highlands. Although it avoids being turned into a passage map by its introduction of another type of monster, the Scar Spectre, and uses the typical Unreal button scheme to guide the player through the map. However, the combat remains fairly intense in comparison to the previous map, and the player is offered a choice to approach the map. The player could either spend some time getting the cloaking device and sneak past the Scar stealth squad, or basically go Rambo and try to take them down. Either way, the map makes for a nice ending and sort of a link to the upcoming boss. Now the design of the map is a much nicer approach to outside world design and terrain, which is a relief compared to the artifacts of the beta and alpha that still remained in the last two maps. The lighting is nothing special, but it makes sense and is decent enough to be convincing in terms of blending in with the rest of the atmosphere. So overall, it was just a small little map that served as a breath of fresh air from the darkness of the previous map and the environment of the previous map, and sort of provides some juxtaposition for the player in terms of distinguishing the atmosphere of the previous map with a new one. Now we're at the boss fight, or we're about to be. So this is actually probably the simplest boss, and to be quite honest, he's pretty easy on normal mode. You would just have to fight him like you would any Unreal Tournament bot and you're done. However, if you're on heroic mode, every so often he's going to bubble and float up in the air, and it's a little bit more tricky. During which this bubble is taking place, he's invincible, and you basically have to avoid the shock flares that are going to be frequently thrown at you. So what you have to do is you have to trigger, as you are hinted at, or well, rather as Nev hints for you to do, what you have to do is trigger the control panels on both sides of the map, on opposite sides of the map. So you have to be careful, because after that, and really during the whole fight, he's a lot more skilled in heroic mode, and he has a sniper rifle in heroic mode, which can do pretty massive damage if you're not dodging. So what you probably should do is take advantage of the laser pistol's heat-seeking rockets to shoot around corners, and maybe just any weapon that can shoot around corners, and avoid him as much as possible until you have to activate the control panels again. If you're lax about it, it's going to be a very annoying and difficult fight, but otherwise it should be pretty straightforward, although still fairly challenging, as it should be on heroic mode. And by the way, the architecture for the boss fight map is very eye-catching. It was inspired by Horace's map, DOM Hori, for Unreal Tournament. Once you kill the boss, maybe you should take a look around and you'll notice what I mean. Sort of an advancement upon the simplistic architecture of the Rocket Lab. It still uses the same textures and sort of the same stylistic feel, but the architecture itself is a lot more complicated, purposefully complex, and ends up being an aesthetic map that perhaps sort of doesn't get much attention because it's a boss fight map.